Chapter 13. A Gift on Our Front Stoop. I saw her huddled there on our front stoop, red curls matted with dried blood and piercing green eyes. She looked up at me as if she knew me, like Erin had been reborn into her. She's not the Erin I knew, however. She's kinder, gentler, and almost magical. But in that first moment, when I saw her shivering there for the first time, it felt as if my friend had come home to me. How could I turn her away? In some way, it was as if I had a second chance, to make it right, to be there when she needed me. I know they are different, and that my friend is long gone, but still. Jess's Journal. Jess and Becca were digging out the last of the potatoes, and David and Jacob were hard at work on the carrots. David's sister Tina was sitting cross-legged on the ground some distance away, oblivious to the cold, studying a new plant that had sprouted that year and comparing it carefully to a sketch in an old worn leather book. The skies were overcast and gray. There was a sharp bite to the wind. Any time now, they'd see rain, maybe even a freezing drizzle. Winter had come late this year, but now it was clearly on its way. Some distance to the north, there came rolling echoes of gunshots. 1, 2, and 3, in quick succession. Quincy tensed, delicately sniffing the air, her hackles in the air. Jess couldn't help wondering what the dog smelled. Quincy's reaction was far from comforting. A small whine sounded in her throat as she continued to stare in the direction of the gunshots, her ears pulled back against her head and her nose twitching. "Do you think Mr. Banks bagged himself a deer?" Jacob called out from the far side of the garden, where he had been put in charge of digging up the garlic bulbs. Jacob was lean, with tousled black hair, dark blue eyes, and a handsome face. He was 7 now, and his last growth spurt had turned his pants into waders. His shirt sleeves ended well before his wrists. Jess made a note to ask the community center for larger-sized clothes. Several of the kids over at research were taller than Jacob. Perhaps they would have some hand-me-downs to spare. The boy looked hopeful, positively dreamy-eyed at the thought of some fresh deer meat. They hadn't eaten venison in well over a month, and the old man would make them a fair trade in meat for some of the apples they had finished picking last month. Jess had shown Becca and Jacob how to wrap the apples carefully in paper so they didn't touch skin to skin. There would be less rot that way. And there they would sit, deep in the crawl space of the basement where it was dark. The apples would stay fresh for months. Whatever did rot would be made into applesauce or fed to the chickens or put in the compost, depending on how bad off it was. Jacob's mind filled with images of a nice, juicy roast, or ribs, and resolved to beg his mother again to let him learn how to hunt. Jess just shook her head and frowned. "Thurman never shoots like that. He fires once and waits. I just heard 3 in a row. That's a stranger or one of the town militia." The town militia had changed drastically since Mayor Farley's son James had taken over. For that matter, the town had changed as well. Farley's influence was a powerful one. He was still the mayor, and there had been no open elections held in over 5 years. As soon as James Farley had turned the respectable age of 20, Mayor Farley had pushed, pulled, and threatened a position for his son. Unbelievably to Jess and several others, he had finally dislodged Todd Stevens, who had been designated the head of the militia 3 years back, after saving the town from a devastating raid. A group of well-armed men and women had tried to cut into the town from a little-used road on the northeast side, a weak area of defense, and steal the entire herd of cattle. The raiders had been occupying a series of caves to the north along the tattered remains of I-435, which had formerly been used for storage for years. The problem with cave dwelling was lack of sunlight and space. both needed for raising livestock and crops. Pale and malnourished, they had still been savage in their attack. Several members of one family living on the outskirts had been murdered, and 3 of the town militia had also lost their lives before the attack had been repelled. That had been a harsh but necessary lesson. The Western Front may have disintegrated, but there were still plenty of people on the edge, desperate to survive, and few left worth trusting. The waves of disease and malnutrition that had turned Kansas City and the surrounding metropolitan area into a tsunami of death, long before the Western Front ever arrived on its doorstep, were still pulsing through. The townships and their local militias were the only thing keeping most of them alive. Todd Stevens had understood this all too well. Todd had been interested in Jess and actively courted her that first year after her return to Belton. He was a good man, and she had thought highly of him, but having a man look at her with interest, any kind of interest, had been absolutely terrifying. She had quietly defined their relationship as being a friendship only. He had been disappointed, but accepted it. He had eventually turned his sights toward Laura, Sarah's daughter, courting her on a daily basis at the cafe on Main Street where Jess and her family had stayed their first day back in Belton. They now had 2 small children. After Mayor Farley had propelled his son into power, Todd and Laura had spent more time with Jess's small family. His parents were dead, and he had talked to her, revealing a snapshot of the struggle from the inside of the higher echelons of the town militia for power, for control. "I don't want to deal with the politics," he had said to her the summer before. "I just want to keep us safe. Why does it have to be like this?" A week later, the announcement had come that James Farley was now in charge of the militia. In a matter of a few months, the mayor's son had undone, if not destroyed, the seamless network of militia members. Those who had dedicated themselves to ensuring the town borders remained safe were pushed aside, and the decisions and leadership positions farmed out to the untested cronies of James Farley and his father. Since he had assumed control, the borders had seen a dozen incursions. The last one had resulted in the death of an entire family. The raid before that had ended without any deaths of residents, but half of the old hospital, now an orphanage, old folks' home, and college rolled into one, had burned to the ground. No one would be attending classes in the near future. Several groups were struggling to find intact housing, and there was no lumber to fix what had been destroyed. As a one, their heads turned toward the north, waiting for more noise, a shot, a yell, but there was only silence. After a moment of listening to the wind and nothing else, Jess turned back to her chore. The temperature was dropping. Rain was coming, and they couldn't afford to lose these roots to an overnight frost. "Come on, you. Let's get these out of the ground and into the basement," she nudged Becca, and then tossed a tiny potato at David, hitting him in the butt and giggling at his startled look. He put on his sternest face. "You just better watch it, lady. You'll start something you can't finish. I'm armed with pointy carrots. Hi-ya!" He flourished the carrot in his hand like a deranged fencer, which set the younger kids to laughing. The bit of humor made short work of an otherwise long and tedious job. When they were finally done, the sky had begun to spit fat drops at them, daring them to stay outside for any longer. Tina had gathered up the old leather journal and her pencil, absently brushing at some plant matter that had attached itself to her patched and worn pants. Recently, she had been adding to the book that Jess had inherited from Grandmother Madge, the old woman who had sheltered them over the winter in a cave east of Clinton. Tina was nearly 11 now, and she was a quiet girl who already showed an incredible knowledge of healing herbs. Her hair, once a muddy blonde, had darkened to a golden brown. She kept the unruly curls cropped short, and they seemed to be the most light-hearted part of her otherwise solemn demeanor. Her smiles, which were rare, were usually used exclusively for smaller children, like Jacob and Becca. Although she could not remember her parents, their abrupt loss, and the loss of Grandmother Madge less than a year later, these events had marked the child in a way that Jess or David seemed unable to change. Despite this solemn demeanor, Tina was gentle and loving and cared deeply for her brother and the rest of her adopted family. It just seemed that she existed in a world of her own so much of the time. Few understood her. The town doctor, Anthony Ridley, was the exception to the rule. He had spent time with her one day while checking on Becca, still a baby at the time, and making sure everyone was surviving the winter without trouble. Todd Stevens, the militia leader, had urged him to drop in on them, worried that Jess was exhausting herself with so many children to look after. While looking over the entire little family, a strange mix of related and unrelated teenagers and children, Dr. Ridley had been surprised by an offering of some strange dried flowers and stems. Tina had looked up, solemnly at him, barely 5 years old, had handed the bundle to him, explaining that it was echinacea. "Missouri coneflower. It's good for keeping away colds." He had looked intrigued and asked her to tell him more. "You can put the flower petals in a tea, dry it first." He had asked her more questions, and he had returned the next day to talk with her more and ask her for 2 other herbs she had pointed out, sitting next to her and gently holding the herbs she handed to him. Over the years, through illnesses and injuries, he would always take an extra few minutes to discuss with Tina her latest miracle plants. After that first encounter, he had made an effort to learn more about herbs, and after a while he began requesting that Jess and her family grow certain herbs or that Tina make certain poultices. He continued to encourage her to learn more and broaden her knowledge with the books that Jess and David collected for her. As time went by, more and more of Tina's infusions and decoctions helped heal the residents of Belton. Despite this, most of the residents remained blissfully ignorant that their medicines were supplied by a girl who wasn't even in her teens. Inside the house, Becca staggered under the weight of the potatoes she was carrying. Jess lifted the basket from her hands before the 6-year-old could drop any of the precious cargo. Becca had jet-black hair that held long curls. Her eyes were still a hauntingly familiar ice blue, but that was where the resemblance to Scott Cooper ended. Becca was soft-spoken and thoughtful. Jess was struck by the memory of Becca's biological mother, Serena, and the way she had spoken on the 2 times that she and Jess had met. Serena had been right. Becca was good and kind, just as Serena had been. The only reminder of her paternal heritage was in her features. Jess had spent hours studying the girl's face, seeing Scott Cooper in a completely different way. Had he ever been good and innocent? He must have been. Jess wanted to believe that all children were, and she wondered what had changed. She had learned to love Becca, just as Serena had said she would. It wasn't hard. The child was sweet and loving, and it was obvious how well she fit in their family unit. Jess leaned down and kissed the little girl, who was protesting that she could carry the heavy load. Becca was also fiercely independent, a trait she shared with the rest of them. For the first winter in years, she could count on keeping most of this harvest and not losing it to marauding rodents, now that they had Lord Flea. Lord Flea, short for Lord of the Flea-Bitten, Bent-Eared, and Generally Ragged Felines, was a tattered-looking cat of indeterminate age. He was not friendly, and Jacob and Becca had learned to leave him alone after the first round of scratches and bites. But he did a bang-up job on the rodents. Nothing to complain about there. And with the biggest harvest in 3 years, thanks to David's research into composting methods, they would have enough root vegetables to last them all winter with extra for trade, as well as seed for next year's crop. Thurman Banks, their nearest neighbor, would be happy to trade his meat for vegetables and for some of the herbs that Jess had painstakingly tied and dried in the heat of the summer. Icy, stinging drops of rain, on the edge of becoming sleet, were falling by the time they finished with the last of the vegetables. Everyone was worn out and ready for a bath by the time they finished. Rinse off as much of the dirt from your hands as you can in the pond, and then help with carrying the buckets of water, Jess directed the younger children. There were already 4 large pots of water on the stove, water boiling merrily away. If they conserved, the icy cold water from the well, mixed with the boiling hot water, wouldn't cool things down too bad, and they could all get through their baths. Bodies washed, stomachs full of fresh vegetable soup, the small family gathered in the living room around a few beeswax candles. Night had fallen soon after the rain began. Jacob snuggled up to Jess, his body transmitting warmth and comfort to her. "Mom, will you read from the story tonight? The Harry story?" he asked her sleepily. He was very tired from the hard work of the day. David had found a set of books on a recent trip into the southern part of Belton, and brought them back for Jess to look over. She had smiled when she read the titles in his hands, and remembered reading the series when she was a child. Harry Potter. Now there were a fine set of adventures. She had not noticed his flushed face when she had hugged him in thanks and excitement, and he had scuttled away before she could see how her affection had affected him. "Yes, sweetie, but just a few pages tonight." Jess stifled a yawn. "I'm all worn out." She carefully opened the book to the marked page and began to read aloud. Barely a few paragraphs later, she set the book down with a soft laugh and looked around. David, Becca, and Jacob were all fast asleep on the floor, softly snoring lumps buried under blankets and cradling pillows. She slowly stood and lifted Jacob up into her arms. He was lanky yet light, thin arms and legs, tall for his age, but she could still lift him easily in her arms. She carefully stepped over and around the others and quietly carried him to bed. The others would be fine sleeping the night out on the floor, but she was happy to burrow under the covers of her bed and listen to the tiny taps of ice-laden particles hitting the glass windows before she drifted off to sleep. For the moment, life was bearable and the winter could come. They were ready for it. The light from the candle on her bedside table guttered and spit as she struggled to keep her eyes open and read over the last narrative she had collected. For the past 5 years, she had been slowly chronicling the histories of the local residents. It had started out with the question, "Where were you on November 4th, the day the Western Front invaded Belton?" Slowly, the stories had changed, taken on different shapes and focus, and she was now chronicling Sarah Turner's life. Sarah Turner, who was actually Sarah Perkins, a woman who had run away from an abusive husband, changed her name and created a new life for herself, as well as for her children Cody and Laura. She reviewed her notes, which she had taken 2 days ago while sitting in the cafe Sarah ran. She had asked Sarah what she wanted to contribute to the town's oral history, and had been stunned by the life story that Sarah had shared. The older woman's face looked haunted. "I did what I thought was best, to protect myself, to protect Cody and Laura, but I always wondered, if I had stayed, if I had managed to get him help for his PTSD, could we have made it?" She had smiled wanly. "In so many ways, I still love him, Jess. I never saw another man I wanted as much as I wanted him. I guess that either makes me a fool or—" She had left the sentence unfinished. Jess's eyes fluttered closed, slipping into sleep as she thought about all of the unknowns, all the lost loves in the world. Her folks, Chris, Alan, and so many more. The papers slipped from her fingers. The candle guttered next to her in the growing pool of wax, and then quietly extinguished. To escape the nightmare, Jess woke up abruptly, surprised to see that it was already light out. The details of the dream were already fading quickly, but gunfire and the memory of a sobbing child were all that remained. She shook her head, as if to rid herself of the last vestiges of the nightmare. The nightmares came every night, but in different forms, and it was a relief to wake up and spend her days too busy to remember the night's horrors. Jess pulled her clothes on quickly and tried to peer out of an open crack in the wood planks covering one of the windows. There wasn't much to see. The icy rain must have tapered off early in the night. Winter, it seemed, was delayed for just one more day. She pulled on tattered wool socks, and her boots followed. A sweater completed her, and she headed out of the bedroom door and into the living room where the others were stirring. Jacob was already awake, sitting at the table and eating an apple. "Hi there, sweetheart. You're up early." She smoothed his unruly hair with her fingers. The boy looked wide awake. He mumbled incoherently from his apple, eyes fixed on a picture book in front of him. "Say that again?" "I been up 'cause of the cryin'," the boy repeated. "She just won't stop cryin' no matter how nice I am to her. She don't talk and she won't look at me or nothin'." The little boy looked disgruntled. "Who won't talk, sweetie?" "The girl on the front porch." Jess considered this statement for a moment. "There's a girl on the front porch?" Jacob rolled his eyes at his mother. Yeah, I told you she woke me up, but she don't talk or nothin'. Maybe she's tarted or somethin'." Jess automatically corrected him. "Anything, retarded, something. And that isn't nice, Jacob, calling someone retarded." She headed for the front door as David struggled to a sitting position, still in the same place on the living room floor where he had fallen asleep. What's going on?" she heard him mutter sleepily as she unbolted the heavy front door. David received no answer as Jess simply stared at the small child huddled against her storm door, blocking it from opening. Jacob walked up behind her. "You'll have to go around, she won't move tall," he commented calmly and walked away down the hall. The small, huddled child did not react, simply rocked back and forth, shaking in the cold. She was tiny, smaller by far than Jacob or Becca, maybe 2 or 3 years old. One thumb was firmly stuck in her mouth, and her hair was a bright red, tangled and full of burrs and leaves. Her face, what Jess could see of it, was filthy and tear-streaked. She was dressed in jeans or overalls, and a thick pink coat that had seen cleaner days. Her tiny sneakers were covered in mud. "Oh my God!" Jess jumped at David's voice in her ear. "What the hell?" He was rubbing the sleep from his eyes and looking as confused as she. Jess said nothing, just turned and ran out of the living room and through the kitchen, the pantry, out through the garage, which was now used as a small barn, and around the house to the front door. She skidded to a stop in front of the stoop, half expecting the tiny child to have vanished before she arrived. But the little girl hadn't moved, not an inch. She didn't even flinch when Jess reached down and gently picked her up in her arms. David held open the door for her then, now that the girl wasn't blocking it from opening. By now, Becca and Jacob were both at the door behind David. Becca still bleary-eyed from sleep, and Jacob curious enough not to be as annoyed with the girl now for not talking to him. Tina had not yet made an appearance. The group of them moved like a school of fish toward the center of the kitchen, where the light was brightest. Jess set the tiny girl on the floor and sat down cross-legged in front of her. Now she could see blood caked on her face, hands, and the front of her overalls. It was mixed in with dark black river mud and dissolved in tracks from the child's tears. She was shivering from fear and cold, and now she looked up at Jess with the most startling, piercing green eyes. "Aaron," Jess whispered to herself, reminded painfully of the childhood friend she had lost. The child did not react, merely stared at her with tears welling up in her eyes, spilling down cheeks and shivering. The sight of tears was like an electric charge that sent Jess into action. Without taking her eyes from the child, she began snapping orders. "Becca, round up some towels and a washcloth. David, please draw some water and set it to boil. Get more from the well in the other buckets. Jake, honey, see if you have some old clothes that are too small for you in your closet, or help Becca find some of hers. Someone get me a lamp lit and put it in the bathroom. Get the first aid kit from my bathroom." As the others rushed in various directions, she gently removed the dirty pink coat, pulled the child into her arms, and gently stood up. Above all, whatever had happened to the little girl in the past day or more, Jess was intent on helping her feel safe. She had to make sure that she wasn't hurt, get her clean and warm, and get some food in her. David briefly laid a hand on her shoulder and said, "I'll take care of breakfast and the kids will help with chores. You take care of her." At 17, he was every inch of a man in height, and Jess was reminded suddenly of how mature and thoughtful he had always been. She could rely on him to take care of the details while she sorted out what injuries were under all of the blood and dirt on the little girl. The next hour was a flurry of activity. Jess closed herself and the small girl inside of the hall bathroom and talked to her softly, speaking of the small family mostly, as she gently removed the girl's clothes and worked to remove some of the larger twigs and burrs from her fine hair. "So, Jacob is my son, and he's 7 years old now. He really likes to have stories read to him. Right now we are reading a neat book called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Have you ever heard of it?" There was no response, but the tears and the rocking had stopped. Jess just kept talking until there was a soft knock on the door. "Mom," came Jacob's low voice, "the bathwater is ready." In the background, he could hear Tina's sleepy voice asking the others what was going on. "Just leave it there, Jacob. I'll get it in a minute," Jess replied encouragingly. She smiled at the little girl, who had jumped at the knock and began rocking again. "I'm going to open the door and get the buckets for the bath, so you just sit right there." She kept her movements slow and deliberate as she pulled the buckets of water in, alternately steaming or cold, and poured them one by one into the tub. No one appeared near the open door, and she silently thanked David for his help. Becca and Jacob were as curious as cats and would have been right there in the bathroom with her if he hadn't warned them off or kept them busy with other tasks. With the buckets left empty outside the door, and the bathroom once again closed with just the two of them inside, she gently held out her hands to help the little girl into the bathtub. "And then there is Becca, who was Serena's daughter, but she died, so now Becca calls me Mom. She's just a few years older than you. She's almost 6 now. She has 5 dolls, and maybe later on, after we get you cleaned up, she will show them to you. We made very pretty dresses for them to wear." She dipped the washcloth in the water and gently washed the little girl's face. Most of the caked-on blood did not appear to be hers, but there were a few scratches on her pale skin. She was a beautiful little child underneath the grime, and she stared at Jess with an intensity that Jess found both compelling and heart-wrenching. Again, she was reminded of Aaron, her best friend, and her heart contracted in pain. Whatever had happened, this child had seen something awful, and considering the amount of blood, whoever had been with her was either gravely wounded or irrevocably dead. She put on her most encouraging smile. "I need to talk to David for a moment, sweetie. Will you be all right for a minute or two?" She was surprised to get a small nod. "Okay, I'll be right back." Oh, wait. She turned and began to rummage under the sink, pulling out 2 toy boats and a handful of battered plastic figurines. Here, you could play with these if you liked. She plunked the toys into the water and slipped out of the door. She was not surprised to see David standing outside, a plate of warm eggs and browned potatoes with the steam still rising from them. His face was knotted with concern as he asked, "How is she? Is she hurt bad?" She smiled a brief reassurance at him. "No. Let's talk out in the kitchen." He followed her, still carrying the plate. The blood on her face and clothes definitely isn't hers, but there's so much of it, David. Whoever she was with, whatever happened to them. Jess closed her eyes and shook her head. It doesn't look good. She's in shock, and she hasn't said one word. I know she can hear and understand me, so I think she's just been horribly traumatized. Take the shotgun and head north. Scout around and see if you can find anything. Tracks, blood, anything. But be careful, for God's sake, and don't be out long or Jacob will want to follow along. He nodded and looked over at the kids standing quietly in the pantry, trying not to be noticed. Jacob looked sheepish for a moment, then rebellious. "But, Mom, Jess quieted him with a glance. "Don't you but-mom me. You stay here and help with the chores, Jacob. I need you here with Becca." She flashed a look at Tina, who was looking quite awake and alert now, and said, "Tina is in charge, and you had better listen to her or answer to me later for it. Now you and Becca go find me some clean clothes for the little girl." And with that, she took the plate of food from David, turned away, and headed back for the bathroom, ignoring the small mutter of complaint she heard issuing from her son. When she slipped back into the bathroom, the toys had floated to the far end of the bathtub, untouched, and the tiny girl just sat there looking at her with those big green eyes. Jess smiled brightly at her. "Hi, sweetie. I'm back to clean the rest of you. But would you like some food first?" She wrestled the fork around until she had a small bite of egg on it and held it out to the little girl. The child opened her mouth like a hungry baby bird and ate the bite Jess deposited inside silently. The plate of food was nearly gone before she heard quiet scuffling outside of the door, and Becca's quiet voice. "Mom, we brought some old clothes of mine." "Just leave them there, hon, I'll get them." She heard the floorboards creak as the children departed. She had kept up a line of chatter all the time she was feeding little Aaron, but there had been no word from the child, just quiet chewing and that intense green-eyed stare. When Jess had asked her what her name was, the child had simply stared at her and said nothing. "Well, we have to call you something. Otherwise it will be, 'Hey, you over there,' or 'What do you know, little Miss So-and-so?'" Jess looked the tiny child over, now out of the tub and a towel wrapped around her small body. "I had a friend once, and she was my best friend. We grew up together, played together right here in this very house." Her eyes blurred for a moment, her voice caught. "She saved my life, and no matter how bad things got, we always had each other. Her name was Erin. Perhaps until you are ready to tell us your name, we can call you Erin. Would that be okay?" Little Erin stared up at her, eyes unblinking, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Jess smiled in relief. "Well then, Erin it is. Now let me see what the kids found to dress you in." The small pile of clothing outside was an insane mix of tiny clothing, worn-out boots, and only one thing that looked like it might fit, pajamas. Well, that would work for now. She grabbed the pajamas and pulled them inside, closing the door behind her. When Erin was dressed in the pajamas and Jess had made another trip out to find a pair of oversized socks to cover her feet, she was ready to meet the rest of the family. Jess held Erin's tiny hand and led her out of the bathroom and into the kitchen, and pulled up a chair for her to sit on at the table. She was so small her head barely peeked over the top of the table. There was a small pitcher of milk on the counter, and Jacob had just finished rinsing the blood from his finger and wrapping it in a small rag. Tears of pain coursed down his cheeks. Jess gave him a hug. "Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry, sweetie." The boy pulled himself up taller. "It's okay, Mom. Satan didn't hurt me too bad," his brave expression belied by the drying tears. That damn goat was always trying to nip Jess or David, but today little Jacob had been the one to milk her and of course gotten bit for his trouble. She turned to Becca, who was eyeing little Aaron with barely contained curiosity. "Becca dear, get those old phone books out for her to sit on." The door from the garage opened, and David walked in, shedding his coat and wiping his boots. He shook his head. "I didn't find any tracks, Jess. Nothing at all. And there's a big one blowing in from the west. Looks like we'll get snow before nightfall." His eyes took in the small girl seated at the table, and he smiled at her. "She looks better. Clean, at least." Becca bustled up with the phone books, and Jess lifted Aaron up for the books to be slid underneath her, elevating her to a normal level, straightened up, and placed a hand on the child's shoulder. "Everyone, this pretty little gift that Jacob found on our front stoop is a bit shy and doesn't feel like talking right now. And since we don't know her name quite yet, I've told her we will call her Aaron until she tells us different." She smoothed Aaron's damp hair with her fingers. "Now she's heard all about you, and I know everyone here is very eager to make friends with you, Aaron." She looked down into the girl's eyes and spoke softly to her. "Here you are safe, and you can stay with us and be part of our family until we find out where yours is." She felt the girl give a small shudder under her hand. "And no matter what, if we find your family or not, you can always stay here with us. We've plenty of room, food, and love to go around." The rest of the group murmured affirmatives, and Becca edged closer. She smiled at Aaron excitedly, obviously overjoyed at the idea of having a playmate. "I have 5 dolls, Aaron, but I'll let you have one of them for your very own. Her name is Stacy, but you could give her a different name if you liked. I'll go get her." And off she ran to retrieve the doll. Jacob carefully picked up the pitcher of the goat milk and poured a glass full to the brim. "Here, drink this. It's real good when it's warm." He set the glass down in front of her, then ran to fetch a rag to mop up the slopped mess. David sat down at the table and watched her, taken aback by how pretty the tiny child was now that the grime and muck had been washed away. Aaron reached forward and pulled the glass toward her slowly, taking sips while never taking her eyes off of the other occupants. Jess considered it all great progress when little Aaron didn't pull away from Becca's reappearance next to her, or the ragged doll that was suddenly thrust in her face. She just eyed Becca gravely, took the doll from her, and regarded the older child gravely. Jess sat down near her and ate the remaining eggs and potatoes that had cooled on the stove, and the rest of the family slowly settled around the table in the kitchen, recognizing a need for calm and normalcy around the traumatized little girl. It wasn't long before Erin's eyes began to glaze over, and her head began to droop. She didn't pull away when David stood, walked around to her side of the table, leaned over, and carefully picked her up in his arms, cradling her like a baby. He said nothing, simply walked to the bedroom that Becca and Tina shared, and placed her gently on Becca's bed, covered her with blankets, quietly tiptoed out of the room, and shut the door silently behind him. "Who knows how much sleep she might have gotten, or how long she was out in the cold," he said, shaking his head and sliding into a chair at the table. He scratched his long hair, looking frustrated. "I couldn't find any kind of tracks. Maybe I should go out further." Jess took his hand in hers. "There's no need. If she had family, which she must have had, All that blood belonged to someone else, and there was plenty of it. Her clothes were absolutely soaked in blood. If she showed up on our front stoop, it was because there wasn't anyone left to take care of her. Those shots we heard yesterday, it's all connected, David. You and I both know she's probably here for good." She missed the flush in his cheeks as he stared down at their entwined fingers, and turned away seconds later as she disengaged her grip and busied herself with clearing the dishes from the table. "Kids, water from the well and dishes now, please." The children obeyed without complaint, quiet, putting together for themselves what had probably happened to little Aaron's family. No strangers to loss or death, it was sobering nonetheless. And all members of the little family were once again reminded of how easily ended life could be. It seemed that the gift on their front stoop was here to stay.